All right, so we will send a follow-up email with the webinar recording and then any other resources that we're going to share with you all. But again, today we are here to talk about shared services and kind of the different ways that you can do that. At the Nonprofit Center, we are, of course, still in the middle of a study around what is the best model for us to build our infrastructure around being able to offer shared services to our nonprofit base. So we're really happy that we've had so many of you engage with this so that we can learn more about your interests and provide us feedback. But I'm really happy to welcome Thaddeus Squire. He is the Chief Commons Steward with Social Impact Commons, and he is the person we've been working closely with throughout this process to understand more about our capacity and kind of think through our business plan for what that's going to look like. So really just happy to welcome Thaddeus and to share more with you all about what we're thinking. So thanks for being here, Thaddeus.
Great. Thanks, Callan and Isis. It's great to be here with the folks at the center for our kind of last orientation around shared services. So um, we're going to we've got an hour together, so not a lot of time, but we're going to do a quick overview of the spectrum of models that are out there, focusing on the ones that are sort of under consideration for the center in offering shared services, and then talk about some comparative views amongst them. Um, there are trade-offs across the spectrum, and our purpose here is not to say which one is good, better, and best, but to simply offer an understanding and vantage of the range of models that are out there so that you all can start to think about, what seems to be the right fit for who we are and what we need in the community. So we'll have about 20 minutes or so of material to present. And then we'll have ample time for Q&A and kind of discussing potentially individual cases. So that's our agenda for today. So just to kind of set the table and be clear about what we mean by shared services and what problem we're sort of seeking to address through that. I think, we're all here because this is a long-standing kind of idea in the nonprofit sector to share more of our infrastructure in the interest of both economies and savings, but also in the interest of growing capacity in a more sustainable way. Um, so leveraging economies of scale, leveraging shared capital around what it takes to kind of stand up these systems and reducing cost are sort of, I think, the frontline things. But I do want to make sure that we equally balance the consideration around capacity building. It's easy in this moment with a lot of attacks on the sector to really focus on how do we defend ourselves, how do we become more resilient with lots of changes in the landscape of funding and so forth. But that's important, but we also need to think about how are we keeping our mission and impact going, and how are indeed are we growing. Shared services can be a solution for both of those, both that defensive and resiliency problem, but also the sort of proactive and sort of growth opportunity that the sector faces. So shared services can mean a lot of different kinds of things or a lot of different services conceivably. We're really focusing on all of those services and systems that are behind the curtain, that are the sort of the back end of any nonprofit operation, that are essentially mission agnostic, but are essential to doing what you do. And these have kind of two dimensions, perhaps to state the obvious, but we feel like we should at least be clear about what we're talking about. There's a whole array of human-centered work that needs to be done. So people with expertise in finance, legal, HR, et cetera. So they're all the jobs that people do, and sharing the level of effort and the expertise of a team of people is a key to kind of shared services, as well as, of course, the sort of inanimate infrastructure that supports those folks, corporate and legal formation, even tax status itself is a kind of infrastructure, right? You've got a certain tax classification that allows you to raise money, insurance, benefit packages, technologies, all that stuff. So these are the two sides of the coin that are shared services. And that's sort of what we're primarily going to be talking about today. Less so sort of frontline programs or front-facing work. That, of course, can also be shared and collaborative, but we're really focusing on the kind of engine, the engine under the hood here. Um, so there is a spectrum of models of how to do this that address that operate slightly differently and address slightly different problems on the landscape, but they all organize into two big buckets, at least in our from our perspective. There's a suite or a set of arm's length relationships, which, true to the name, indicates you've got two completely separate, independent organizations that are collaborating or sharing some resource together. Management and governance is separate, so is compliance. And we're going to talk about two principal models, Model C, fiscal sponsorship and technical assistance under the arm's length side. And then there are integrated shared services, meaning the corporate and operating infrastructure that is being shared is actually combined or integrated together. So this is a co-management relationship. Often compliance matters and legal matters are consolidated, combined. So is the infrastructure itself. So everybody's using one accounting system, for example, or going through one compliance process together, as opposed to tens or hundreds of compliance processes. And the two examples we're going to talk about today on that front are Model A, or comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, and mergers and acquisitions, or M&A, as it's often referred to. So getting right into the models and starting with the arm's length bucket that was on the left. Model C, fiscal sponsorship, or the pre-approved grant model of fiscal sponsorship. They goes by both indicators. Um, just to note, this kind of alphabetical label for this model of fiscal sponsorship comes from an inventory of the different models that was done by an attorney in the early 90s. There are about 6 different models of fiscal sponsorship, but the two that are most predominant, that are most common, we're going to talk about today, and this is one of them, probably the most commonly known. And this is a model that was designed or is designed to enable essentially a non-exempt, either an individual or for-profit company that is not tax exempt, to access charitable funds for use on a charitable project. So the project itself does indeed have to be charitable, um, but the access comes through essentially a sponsor organization, a nonprofit. In this case, this would be the center, prospectively, that agrees to apply for grants or receive donations on behalf of the project. And we use the term project to denote sort of the operating unit, which would be the equivalent of an organization or charitable project. That grant is received by the sponsor and then re-granted down to the project, which again could be an individual or a corporate entity. And then that individual and entity carries out the project. This is a way of sharing essentially the tax exempt and compliance and some limited accounting infrastructure, but really it's about providing access to charitable funds for temporary projects or non-exempt individuals. This is used by startup nonprofits. It's used by for-profit companies that want to do charitable work on the side in their community, and a number of other use cases. There is a kind of contractual structure that governs this, and there is a accountability chain that goes back up to the funding sources, the grant makers, through the sponsor, so that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed in the funding relationship. The sponsor here is responsible for the charitable funds on behalf of the project. The other sort of arm's length model that's very common out there and often offered by alliances and associations that serve nonprofits is technical assistance. This is really not terribly exotic. We tend to use the word technical assistance in the nonprofit space to denote one nonprofit providing services to another. But these are services just like any that you might be already contracting out there as a vendor relationship. This is a fee for service relationship, plain and simple. just with the one nonprofit providing the services and another nonprofit paying that provider for the services. Sometimes if there's a philanthropy involved in this, these services can be offered for free or 100% subsidy or some percent of subsidy. Um, there are also cases where the nonprofit provider is offering them essentially at market, but really organizing them, customizing them, and making them available to a particular community, like the members of the center. So in this case, the provider would be the center, and the recipient organizations would be the various member organizations in Northeast Florida. Um, this is, again, not unlike many of the relationships you're already familiar with, but one that's under consideration. And the services here can be pretty wide-ranging, but we typically see bookkeeping and accounting, of course, since that's perennially needed, grant writing, marketing assistance, sometimes HR or elements of HR, et cetera. We rarely see legal since that gets into regulated issues, or that's a regulated profession. But those tend to be the core services that are offered. Sometimes general management consulting, capacity building. So those are the two arm's length models. Starting now with the two integrated models, we have comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, or Model A fiscal sponsorship. And in this model, the project, or the sort of charitable operating unit, which would, as I said, otherwise be possibly a standalone nonprofit out there, becomes a program under the sponsor organization. So it's a program under the umbrella of the sponsor. And as a program under the sponsor, it is plugged directly into all of the backbone infrastructure of the sponsor. So it's part of its corporation. It enjoys its tax exemption. The sponsor is insuring the project fully through general liability and directors and officers. It's doing all of the finance work, all of the compliance work, all of HR. It is the employer of record, contractor of record, insurer of record. So it's doing that whole suite of back office work. And for a percent of the project's income, the project pays a kind of percent of income. It's between 10 and 15% annually to receive or share those services. So it's paying its portion of that cost, that overhead cost, but ultimately sharing it with both the sponsor and all the other projects that might be under that sponsor. This model, I started one of these in Philly. We had 120 arts and culture organizations or projects under it that would have otherwise been 120 tiny nonprofits. But living under our umbrella, we did one audit, one 990. We had one insurance policy as opposed to 120 of all of those. So you can start to appreciate some of the economies of scale that can occur with this. Critical in this model, the sponsor is receiving all income and paying all bills in this model. Critical, though, to understand here is that the project retains its front-facing identity and independence. So your website is your website, your name remains your name, your relationships with donors, constituents remain yours. And most importantly, you can leave anytime you want. So this is not a merger. This is a resource sharing model that is reversible and changeable. So you retain agency and autonomy over your mission and vision while you're sharing the back end of the sponsor. So there's a nice balance in this model between independence and autonomy and being able to share that mission agnostic infrastructure. So finally, on the last model, we'll look at the second integrated model, are mergers and acquisitions. These are quite prominent in the conversation today, particularly amongst philanthropy. We think that they certainly serve a purpose and have a time and a place and are part of the toolkit of shared services, so we wanted to cover them. These are really two different kinds of transactions. In a merger, one nonprofit organization essentially merges or combines entirely with another nonprofit. And the nonprofit that is being combined does not survive. It's often referred to as the non-surviving organization. It's a little morbid, but that's what they that's the term that they use. That's why there's a dotted line around that green circle. And all assets, often brand and identity is absorbed. Often most or all of the staff are absorbed, and the program assets and anything else are absorbed into the merger organization, the survivor organization. That's an all-in model, and unlike comprehensive fiscal sponsorship or the Model A that we just talked about, these are generally not reversible. So when you combine through a merger, generally I mean, it's theoretically possible you could undo them, but the intention is that it's a one-way street. It's one and done. Similarly, although a little lighter than a merger, is an acquisition, which usually concerns like a program or an asset. It might be a piece of property you want to get rid of, or a program that you really think is valuable, but you don't want to run it. Another organization like you does want to run it, so you transfer, either you sell or you contribute that program to the new organization, and they run it from there on. So in this case, there's an acquirer nonprofit and a program seller. This is different from the merger in that the organization that is offloading the asset, the program, typically survives. It carries on and does whatever other work it's doing. It doesn't go away as in a merger. So this is a more limited case. This is really about moving a particular asset from point A to B. Sometimes there's a financial transaction, but often in the nonprofit space, it's essentially a contribution, since our goal is not necessarily to be profit seeking. Most of these transactions are essentially contributed. So that's a very brief overview of mergers and acquisitions, and what they mean and how they work. Likewise, to a merger, acquisitions are typically a one-way street. So when you donate or sell somebody a program, you generally are not intending to want it back. So that's where, again, both of these models differ from the Model A scenario we talked about, where it is reversible. You can leave whenever you want as a project. So before we go to the last little bit, we have a few more slides here. Just wanted to pause and see if there are any questions on just the mechanics of the basic models, the two arm's length and the two integrated ones. Happy to go back to slides too. Clear as mud, I see. Great. All right. We'll have some more time at the end for questions if they pop up. Also, feel free to pop things in the chat if there's anything that's unclear. So in thinking about all of these models, there are kind of two buckets of use cases, if you will, or value propositions. There is, of course, startup, nonprofit, or temporary project work. A lot of the nonprofit space is home to kind of temporary or short-term projects, often collaborative projects between multiple organizations. And then, of course, we have a steady stream of new initiatives popping up in communities all the time. They tend to reach for comprehensive or Model C fiscal sponsorship because it's a way to access charitable donations overnight very quickly. Or if you're using Model A, essentially stand up a full charge nonprofit infrastructure overnight or have access to that. So if you're a new project, you might want to plug into a Model A, you get all the benefits of that infrastructure and you can get to work right away. For established nonprofits, there are a lot more options. And of course, for startups, you can go out and start your own brand new nonprofit and take it through the IRS. Right now, that's becoming more and more complicated. That's always been a complicated process, but now more than ever, with the reduction in force at the IRS, it's proving very difficult to get new nonprofits through. So we see more and more new work landing with fiscal sponsors. If you're an established nonprofit, you have some choices that have a lot to do with what you're comfortable with, what your culture is, what are the particular capacity problems or opportunities you're trying to solve. And those, of course, run from coming under a Model A. We're seeing more existing nonprofits move under a comprehensive fiscal sponsor, not because they need the tax exemption, but because they want to share all that back office infrastructure. And we found that we've done some comparative costing for organizations operating below 2 million, that operating under shared infrastructure of a comprehensive sponsor versus just standalone out there on the landscape represents a potential savings of up to 50% of your overhead. So you can shave off a lot of that back office cost. That means more money for frontline programs. If that's not your comfort zone or your desire, there is technical assistance. So there's simply contracting a lot of those services arm's length if that feels like a better support for you. So you really have that kind of choice on the integrated and arm's length sides. So briefly, let's do a kind of flyover of how these array or lay out in a little bit more detail relative to each other, so that maybe you can locate yourself somewhere on this spectrum. So broadly, and this is what we experience out there on the landscape, different organizations, different leaders have different comfort levels with being in closer, more integrated co-management relationships on the right, to wanting to keep a fair amount of distance on the left. Of course, trust, familiarity, all those things with the service provider, in this case, the center, is critical. One note that I forgot to mention, but I don't want to leave off, the merger and acquisition models that we covered. That is a model that the center, since we've been referring to the center, and this is really, these are things that are under consideration for the center. Mergers and acquisitions is something that the center might support in terms of consulting or facilitation resources, but of course would probably not be the acquirer or the mergee, if you will, the organization to which things are being merged. That's not really the purpose of the center. It needs to remain kind of agnostic relative to its members. So while the center might be a fiscal sponsor, Model A or C, and it might provide technical assistance, those might be direct services it offers. In the future, M&A will be supported likely through technical assistance. I just wanted to point out that difference in that case. So in the range of approaches, I've put the two arm's length examples kind of together in one little diagram. On the left, the technical assistance organization in this case would be the centers we've mentioned prospectively. And then the two kind of integrated models are in the middle and right. And as you move from arm's length to integrated, and this should be kind of intuitive, but you do gain some efficiencies, some significant efficiencies going more to the integrated side, but you also are in a much more intimate, integrated co-management relationship. You have much more distance and daylight between the orgs who are sharing on the left at the arm's length side, but because of that, costs do go up. Overall, that arrangement is more costly on all sides. And you do lose some efficiency because you've got duplication of systems and entities and costs that are intrinsic in an arm's length relationship. So these are the trade-offs. And I'm not saying that, left or right is better. It is a balance between what's the right thing for you in terms of relationship and how much kind of efficiency do you want to overall achieve. So as I just mentioned, and drilling down a little bit more into that, a lot of the higher costs on arm's length come from the fact that you're working on a fee basis, an hourly dollars for hours kind of basis or a retainer basis. And that comes with sort of more fully loaded fees to make up for kind of overhead. So net cost on both sides can be a little bit higher depending on if there's subsidy or not. As I mentioned, any of these models can be subsidized by philanthropy in the interest of lowering costs. you do get essentially duplication of systems. So if you've got two organizations, you've got a provider and one client organization um, sharing an accounting professional, you still got two accounting systems that are being used. And you've got, two corporate entities in that relationship that need a certain amount of care and feeding each year, and that comes with costs. So overall, the costs of the system are higher on the left than on the right, where you start to, for example, with comprehensive fiscal sponsorship and mergers and acquisitions, everybody's using one accounting system. There is one insurance policy, one compliance process. So you start getting some meaningful savings when you start removing multiple entities from the equation. And that's why many people do reach for the more integrated side of things. Just want to note that your day-to-day operations, like how you use or experience these various models, is not terribly different. They all will follow workflows for day-to-day stuff like paying bills, getting contracts signed, hiring new employees. All of these workflow processes are probably ones you're already familiar with if you work in a larger nonprofit where it's got sort of more articulated management processes. But in all of these relationships, the initial, the that are arm's length and also the Model A relationship on the integrated side, all of the initiative comes from the project or the client or customer. You're driving the boat. But all of these administrative processes, whether bill paying or hiring, go through a certain workflow. And we get a lot of questions about does that experience change? And our end conclusion is it really shouldn't or doesn't across the models. What is changing is the sort of nature of power and decision making, and also legal relationship and risk, which we'll talk about in a second. So I've already sort of covered this on the previous slide, but with arm's length, you've got multiple systems and compliance processes in the mix, and that adds cost overall to the system. Whereas on the integrated side, you're deduping or reducing that redundancy, and that comes with some meaningful savings. One other consideration is risk and legal liability. Of course, at arm's length, you've got two separate entities. Their risks, their liabilities remain completely separate. With Model A fiscal sponsorship and M&A, we are combining all of those risks and liabilities. On the flip side of combining risks and liabilities, we're hoping that we have more acute management capacity to manage risk. So risk management is primarily management, not just insurance and things, but really having good policy systems oversight. And we do see benefits to consolidating risk, in fact. Most people hear that and think automatically something that's negative. But a well-run comprehensive sponsor or a well-run merged organization should be able to actually mitigate risk through better management. This is just kind of a tabular view of the same comparison. I know this is a little bit of redundancy, but we want to kind of make sure that we're clear on these concepts as you're thinking about the different models. So arm's length, cost to deliver is roughly equivalent, but the cost to the user does change a little bit across those relationships, from being a little bit more expensive on the left to less expensive on the right. As I said, day-to-day operations and independence of identity, really no difference. We're accepting here the merger and acquisition case because I think at this point you should see that that's a unique case. It does belong on that integrated side of the spectrum, but because it's not reversible, it is something that's um, different from all the other three, where there is kind of exitability or reversibility involved. So independent decision making remains largely in place across the spectrum. But there is a difference between the co-management relationship in Model A versus completely independent decision making in the arm's length models. Legal issues are either integrated or share or separate or shared. And of course, in all cases, you can exit whenever you want. I think I'm going to conclude with this. We just got a couple more charts to get through here. So drilling down on that general overview, you do see a shift in services across the spectrum. So Model C fiscal sponsorship is really solving, hey, I can't apply for grants or receive donations. I want to be able to do that. Model C allows you to do that. The technical assistance model can vary widely. I mentioned sort of the core services that are typical. Comprehensive fiscal sponsorship is that core suite of services, often with a la carte additions to it. And mergers and acquisitions, of course, are simply a combination of two or three organizations. Ability to exit, we've talked about, does change, particularly when you move into the merger and acquisition space. The legal relationship is also different transactionally across the spectrum. In each case, there's a contract or an agreement governing the relationship. Decision-making also changes somewhat significantly across the spectrum, as well as risk and sort of the degree of legal combination. And this is really why we kind of array them in this order, because it does kind of graduate roughly and pretty continuously left to right in terms of how these changes come about. And finally, in terms of cost, cost for implementation here means really what does it take to get into it, to get into the relationship, to start working together and sharing services. And there is sort of definitely a more cost on the Model A and mergers and acquisitions side, largely because there's more due diligence. Because you're combining infrastructure, it's not something that you can do casually. There's a little bit more mutual due diligence on both sides, and certainly the same for mergers and acquisitions. Costs to the user client on an ongoing basis, varies for technical assistance, does go up for Model A because you're getting a lot more than Model C. And is kind of wholly integrated when it comes to M&A. Economies of scale, both the fiscal sponsorship models are highly scalable. We see sponsors with hundreds, some with thousands of projects under one nonprofit entity, all those projects retaining their independence in identity and decision making. Technical assistance has a little bit more limited scalability because it's dollars for hours, and the cost of an hour does not go down the more people you add who are taking advantage of the services. So it's sort of a direct proportional economy of scale, whereas with comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, you have the ability to share internal staff a little bit more discreetly and efficiently across multiple organizations, so cost goes down. And obviously with M&A, you're completely integrated into the operations of the surviving org. The cost conventions across this in terms of what you would pay for Model C, it nationally ranges 6 to 8% of revenue. For Model A, 10 to 15%. And with technical assistance, it really varies depending on whether there's subsidy or other factors involved. Just as a kind of concluding thought, particularly comparing Model A to mergers and acquisitions, we get a lot of questions about that. Our general line or perspective is that you get 95, 98% of what you're seeking in terms of operational efficiencies with mergers. With Model A, you get that same benefit, but the difference is you do get to retain that independence of identity and agency over your work. That you are essentially, in most cases with mergers or acquisitions, you are giving that up or ceding that to another organization. So it's a nice balance between really efficient resource sharing and retaining your independence. And we, for that reason, really see it as a much more scalable alternative to mergers and acquisitions, which typically only concern, say, 2 or 3 organizations at a time. You never hear of 75 organizations deciding to merge together. I've never heard of such a thing. So to conclude, we see with the current environment, which has been Um, there's a lot more stress and strain, although a lot of the stresses and strains have always been there, have long been there in the nonprofit sector in terms of sustainability, particularly at small scale. But we do see philanthropy wanting to use fiscal sponsors or some of these alternative structures to move money to work that might be politically or socially controversial. So we're hearing some of that happen. So donor advised funds, collaborative funds, fiscally sponsored projects are providing a little bit of distance for philanthropy. I mentioned, it's hard to get new nonprofits through the IRS these days for a variety of reasons. So people are moving more towards shared models, in particular fiscal sponsorship. Um, we are also seeing some of these shared structures, both M&A and comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, as kind of safe harbor or a kind of repositioning platform for organizations that have really been hit hard by funding cuts or need to kind of restructure substantially, but don't want to wind up or go away. So it ends up being a bit of a safe harbor value, as well as a way to kind of gain operational efficiencies and grow. And finally, we do see some tendency for some charitable activities to kind of exit the nonprofit umbrella and operate essentially privately, but retain access to donations and grants through a Model C or regranting fiscal sponsorship relationship. So to sum it all up, depending on who you are and where you are in your charitable work, there are kind of three paths we see. And if you're thinking about all of these options, it might be good to kind of think about where do I generally fall in these three paths? If you're a startup, temporary project, just an individual doing work, or a for-profit company doing nonprofit work, you really want to look at probably either Model A or Model C as your solution because you get the tax exemption and you get other benefits of infrastructure there. If you're an established nonprofit and you're just looking to improve your admin capacity or resize, you either want to look at technical assistance or probably Model A. If you're essentially not interested in giving up all of your agency and identity. But if you are an established nonprofit and you know a couple out there that are very much like you, typically these are relationships, when mergers happen, it's typically relationships that have been in place for a long time between peer organizations. It's typically one or two at a time. And you think that there's enough programmatic synergy to warrant combining everything with them or certain programs, then you might want to look at M&A as your option. But these are the kind of three kind of paths that we see, most common and guiding choices out there in the landscape. So that is all we've got here in terms of presentation. I'm happy to go back to any slides and we can take some questions. So Julia, let's see, in Model A, what are the governance liability lines? Yes. So for Model A projects, it's not required by law, but it's strongly encouraged as a best practice. And in particular, if you already have an advisory or governing board, if you're an established nonprofit, that board becomes an advisory board. The fiduciary board of record is the sponsors board. In this prospective scenario, that would be the centers board. The advisory board of the project retains all of the functions that you want the board to have. It could be fundraising, budget setting, strategic guidance, networking, subject matter expertise, all the typical things, right? That's often retained. You have your own bylaws, you have your own way of governing yourself. That's done in concert with the sponsor, but the sponsor is holding the chief fiduciary liability for all of your funds. So they're there to set policies, make sure that compliance is happening, set baseline policies on HR, make sure that you're not spending charitable funds, on something that's not appropriate legally. They're not there to meddle in your decisions, provided they're, mission related and such. Sponsors do keep, even though it's an integrated legal relationship, they do keep an arm's length and kind of trust-based relationship with their projects to say, you run your business. We're just there to make sure that the absolute basic legal and financial health is maintained. So that's how the governance structure is split. It's essentially shared in a Model A structure. Does that help, Julia, or do you have some other follow-ups?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Sarah. Yeah, and James, as we get further down the road in this project with the center, we may, in all likelihood, particularly once there's a clear decision about sort of how the center wants to support these models or which of them and how, we are anticipating doing some piloting work as a first step, of course. And so we may be addressing individual organizational boards and such. And of course, this deck and resource will be shared, so you could freely, share it certainly with your stakeholders. I don't know if somebody wants, if either Callan or Isis, you want to take the question from Sarah. Don't want to speak fully for the center, but
So as far as where we're at in the feasibility study, what is the current capacity to support the existing staff, and what are the triggers, participation levels required to launch new positions at the center? Yeah, I mean, we're in that process now, I would say, of really figuring out our business plan for that piece. So our timeline right now is to do that part. Like, we're kind of wrapping up the focus groups as far as doing this presentation and getting feedback from you all. And we are going to look at launching an actual pilot with a couple of nonprofits that we're working with, hopefully no later than the spring of 2026. So that is where we're at, is doing that kind of research around what is it going to take to, and how many positions do we need to hire. I know Dawn is on the call, so I don't know if she has anything else she wants to say to that, but that's where I know we're at right now.
Thank you, Callum. And yes, we are actually working on that grant proposal right now. We also have some continued work to do with Thaddeus in round 2 of the project that we're working on. So my recommendation to anybody that's on this call is, if you have an interest in joining a shared services, fiscal sponsorship, mergers and acquisition strategy, please let us know. We are moving pretty quickly forward. We also have, at our conference in October, more information that will be shared. So you'll get information sent to you about that. So please just stay tuned to all of our communications, whether it's Bridging the Sector or Nuggets or website, because we are definitely moving forward. We've done a lot of investment already, and looking forward to launching.
great, thanks.
So I have a question about, hi, I'm Sarah, I'm with UCOM Urban Serve. With whether it's a merger, acquisition, we UCOM lives in this world a little with our faith partners. We're a coordinated outreach for about 62. And so whether we have a memorandum of understanding or there's just, neighbors helping neighbors, we all know where we sit. When you start getting into, or we get into list shares, who owns the data? Is it soliciting? Is it helping? So here I've noticed in Jacksonville that tends to be the trigger that stops and puts up walls pretty quickly on how we collaborate as in the nonprofit sector, on who owns the story of the individual we're serving. So we've worked really hard to not compete in the sandbox and just offer support, broker relationships, and not try to build a Walmart, which it sounds like, this potentially could be. So, and one piece where I've been investing and working really hard in is our seniors, specifically with Meals on Wheels, right? So vulnerable, protected population, many agencies with buy-in and wanting to serve. But we find even in the method of service, some is helpful and some appears helpful until you talk to the individual that, like whether they have arthritis to even not be able to pull off the the top or don't have a microwave for their Amazon meals, right? So I guess my question with that long preamble is with fiscal responsibility and oversight with collaborative grants, or if there's a fiscal agent or um, who is providing the oversight? Would that be the governance board on just the ethics, right, of engagement with the humans, even if it is helping someone find their sense of belonging, that even that space of nonprofit work. Where do you see that working with this model or
Well,
the vision of moving forward? Mhm.
yeah, I mean I mean aside from say a merger situation where you're taking two of those agencies that really maybe are serving the same population, same services, and they just want to combine their efforts, and there's no more in a merger, there's no more us and them, right? After the merger, it is just us. For Model A fiscal sponsorship, in that, in that scenario, yeah, I will note that comprehensive fiscal sponsorship was invented by the health and human services sector in the late 50s. It's been around, the oldest one is in Boston. So it grew out of HHS largely from two fronts, managing big government grants from NIH and related agencies, but also to get certain key infrastructure under frontline health and human services organizations. And in that context, there is a way to kind of balance the hyperlocality of those agencies and that value, like who owns the story, as you said, that relationship. In many cases, there's a lot of value in retaining those frontline identities, relationships, all that stuff remains the projects in a comprehensive sponsorship relationship. The the sponsor does need to have some degree of specialization or ability to specialize in certain submissions. So things that are, say, regulated practices, like a lot of HHS is, the things that are subject to certain insurance or other risk and sort of ethical um, codes of conduct, et cetera, all that, are things that the sponsor also needs to have experience in. So there are HHS specialists. And either the project can define some of the unique contours of those like ethics of how they deliver, or the sponsor can set some general standards for themselves. So for example, I'll use a parallel example. So there's a fiscal sponsor for journalism, and they have a common code of journalistic ethics that if you become sponsored by them, you need to at least subscribe to this basic code of journalistic ethics. Other than that, your editorial vision is your prerogative as a newsroom. And so there's ways to kind of share common ethical and operating standards while retaining the independence of some of the operating units that are doing that work because they have special relationships or they're really, close to the folks that are on the ground that have the need. So it's a balance that we see that model being used for quite a bit. If mergers are really not what people want to do, you know. Because there is I think more of a tendency if a whole bunch of health and human services organizations merge to become sort of a Walmart phenomenon, right? Because you've got everybody sort of in one box under one brand. Whereas Model A fiscal sponsorship gives you a lot of those benefits, but to the outside world and in operating reality, it's not Walmart. So
And
that's
have
just
you found in your experience as people move, or if they've moved to that model, good examples where um, um, that collaboration mitigates some of the anxiety of competition with these competitive grants?
100%. In fact, there's a Health and Human Services comprehensive sponsor in Philly, Urban Affairs Coalition, and they are constantly, there's actually one staff person who's exists sort of like an organizer within the community. They have close to 100 operating units under them, and they coordinate grant seeking with, well, formerly, I don't know what they're doing now, but with major government agencies, for example, like they would go all in on one RFP from HUD together, all the relevant operating units under them. So say 6 people are doing housing work, they'll go together as a collaborative grant, or if it's a private grant, same thing. So there's a lot of coordination and having that common platform reduces the friction and sort of the, the competition that sometimes negatively arises in those opportunities.
I understand what you're saying with housing. I'm on the COC board here for Northeast Florida. And so that collaborative and that HUD grant and the larger federal grant, I understand. I'm thinking more state and local and specific Jacksonville. It seems our maze can get pretty territorial and tricky.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, I see it, the competition is real, but it exists at all those levels, whether you're going to a local agency or private philanthropy. The other reality of comprehensive sponsorship is grant makers, whether they're agencies or private foundations or individuals, treat each of the projects as independent projects in their evaluation. So for example, we had my previous fiscal sponsor, which was arts and culture focused. Every year we had over 80 individual grant applications under one EIN go into the city's cultural funding arm. Okay. And the city was clear, and it started to build actually a culture in the community that, look, you're going to get a grant or not get a grant based on your merits as an arts project or organization, right? Because you get a grant doesn't necessarily mean that somebody else doesn't get a grant. It's not this kind of perceived, and that's the reality in the foundation world. I mean, yes, there's finite resources, but the funding world makes its decisions based on the merits of the program. And that doesn't change when you're under a fiscal sponsor, even though transactionally you've got one entity receiving those grants. We had 90% of those grants funded every year. So those were, individual grants all going to the same entity, but the grant makers saw each of those as unique grants awarded on their individual merits. And that's how it would be for any other mission area like HHS. It's a culture shift, to be sure, and it's something that folks are often wary of, but that is how it works. And we've been doing this for about 60 years with these models. So it can work. Let's see here. I want to address Julia's question here about risk, which is a great question. There are two ways to respond to that. So, yes, as you can imagine, when you combine a whole bunch of programs, there is some degree of shared risk to the entity hosting them, in this case, the center. First of all fiscally sponsored projects are completely segregated and sub-accounted within the sponsor system. So your assets essentially are restricted to your project. And that does help bar access, in terms of litigation or liability issues. One project's funds can't be accessed by another. There are also legal structures. We didn't go into them today, but there are some more complicated legal structures that comprehensive sponsors are using to allocate risk to subsidiary LLCs that help kind of protect. So there's some legal and transactional mechanisms to help mitigate risk. There is also safety in numbers. So we are seeing some fiscal sponsors that are really staying the course and supporting equity and LGBTQIA matters, and they are taking advantage of the fact that they actually have mostly organizations with that mission under their roof, and they are able to collectively build legal defensive resources and other resources to help protect those missions. So there is a stronger together answer to your question as well. But all of that's to say there is a shared risk there, and it is a consolidated risk. You're absolutely right about that. Oh, thanks, Isis, for your response as well. Yeah. We are, in fact, seeing some fiscal sponsors specialize or create special purpose affiliates. So they're becoming sort of little networks of affiliated nonprofits that share a central management so that they can contain different mission risks separately from each other. That's in large part in response to our current socio-political climate. But that is something that's emerging on the landscape as a model to manage risk as well. Other questions, comments?
I have a question. I am curious. I'm part of the First Coast Girls Initiative. It's a collaborative collection of girl serving organizations, but it's not its own 501(c)(3). And I was curious, in this type of model, whether it's Model C or whatever, would those types of entities be able to participate in this as long as they become a member of the center?
I can answer that abstractly. The condition of membership is a matter up to the center, but and I'm sure they can answer that. But I mean, an organized group, whether it's an unincorporated association or just a company or association without tax exemption, certainly could use any of these. I mean, you could use Model C to get grants if that's a problem. You could keep your corporation. So the one thing I didn't mention, I'll mention very, very quickly here, is if you're an existing nonprofit and you move your operations under a comprehensive sponsor, you typically keep that nonprofit sort of on the shelf. You don't wind it up, you don't throw it away. Because if you ever want to leave and go back to operating the way you were, you reanimate your original formation and you carry on the way you were. That would be true also of a non-exempt association, potentially such as yours. So you could take advantage of Model A as well. But in terms of membership, I'm assuming that's going to be a condition, but maybe Dawn, you could speak to that. Or Callan.
I was seeing if Dom was going to respond. Can you repeat the question? I apologize.
Would these services be contingent upon membership in the center?
That's a great question. I'm honestly not sure. I would think, yes, I would think that it would be ideal if it was a membership benefit as opposed to something else, but I cannot say as we are in the middle of doing that kind of business planning research.
Yeah,
Well, it's
I'll add.
I was
Sorry.
just gonna say, if we maybe also a question we want to ask people after this process as well. Like, anyway, it is a good question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, I think it'd be hard to not have those two things interlinked, in terms of like addressing any capacity building needs that come out of those relationships. Like I think we'd want to have that infrastructure in place to be able to address any of those needs. But I don't know necessarily if that would have to be through a membership model, but that is what we have now.
Great.
It is actually interesting, just on the same topic. The nonprofit center used to do the financial books for this entity I'm mentioning. So I wonder if there's a historical of like how that was set up too, just as something to, as you're looking back in archives on.
Yeah, the Nonprofit Center has been a fiscal sponsor in the past for a couple of organizations, and I know that we have provided kind of that administrative support in the past. So that is where some of this has even begun, like this research and us looking into this is the relationships that we've had and what we've learned from that and how can we kind of scale that. So yeah, absolutely. I do appreciate that comment, Sarah.
Great. Well, thank you. Great questions.
Anything else? I know we're right at 10. All right. Well, I don't think if there's nothing else, then we're going to share this back out. And we, again, super appreciate your feedback, and I'll send a survey link in the email. Okay.
Thanks, everybody.